Hey everybody, this video is all about the Beatles album, Beatles For Sale, and 10 facts that you maybe didn't know about this album. So Beatles For Sale was released in 1964, and like all the Beatles albums, or all the early Beatles albums, it has a mono mix and a stereo mix. And I like both of the mixes, and I think, like a lot of the other Beatles early albums, that you should own the mono mix and the stereo mix. Both are excellent. So let's get right into this and talk about 10 facts that you maybe didn't know about Beatles For Sale. As usual, I have notes. So here we go. Fact number 1. Let's talk about the actual album cover. This is a very famous photo of the Beatles. Now this photo was taken by Robert Freeman. Robert Freeman took a lot of the Beatles album covers, including With the Beatles. He took the photos that were used in the A Hard Day's Night album cover. He also did Rubber Soul and Help. And so he took this photo, and this photo was taken in Hyde Park in London. And apparently Robert Freeman approached Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, and said that he wanted to take a shot of the Beatles out in nature. So they decided that the best place to get the Beatles out in nature and make it easy would be in London in Hyde Park. So he took this very, very moody photo of the Beatles. And if you look, the Beatles are not smiling in this photo at all. Now that wasn't a new thing, because the With the Beatles album cover, the Beatles also didn't smile in that one, which is also a very moody shot. But this album cover, I think a lot of people kind of took this as the Beatles feeling like they were a little bit tired and a little bit like road weary or something like that. But really, it's just a really great shot of the four of them. They look really cool. They always look cool, but they look exceptionally cool in this shot, this great shot by Robert Freeman. So that is a little bit about the actual album cover. Okay, now fact number 2. This is a crazy fact to think about. Beatles For Sale was the Beatles' 4th album released in a span of 21 months. That is crazy to think about, because most bands, like modern day bands or solo artists or whatever, release an album like every 2 or 3 years, right? That's pretty normal. The Beatles released 4 albums in 21 months. That's almost unheard of. And there's a great quote by Neil Aspinall, the Beatles roadie and just good friend. And the quote is as follows. It really sums up Beatles For Sale here. He says, "No band today would come off a long US tour at the end of September, go into the studio and start a new album, still writing songs, and then go on a UK tour, finish the album in 5 weeks, still touring while they were recording, and have the album out in time for Christmas. But that's just what the Beatles did at the end of 1964. He said a lot of it was down to naivete, thinking that this was the way things were done. If the record company needs another album, you go and you make one." That's a great quote from Neil Aspinall talking about Beatles For Sale and how the Beatles were touring multiple tours, and in between touring and everything else, they would try to find time to record this album. And it's a great, great album, by the way. So it's just amazing the Beatles were able to do stuff like that, and at the height of Beatlemania. So it's really a testament to how amazing the Beatles were as a band. Okay, fact number 3. So Beatles For Sale, if you take all of the Beatles albums and you had to label one of the Beatles albums that had a country flavor to it, or a Beatles country album, Beatles For Sale would be it. In fact, John Lennon, at the time of the album that this album was released, he has a great quote. And John Lennon's quote is as follows: "You could call our new one a Beatles country and western LP." And that's very, very true, because if you think about it, songs like I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black, and All Fall a Sun, they all have like country vibes about them. And then in addition to that, there are 2 covers on the album that are just straight on rockabilly, country, and western songs. And they are Honey Don't and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. So if you think about it, Beatles For Sale really has a country influence on it. And it makes it a very unique album within the Beatles catalog. But of course, all of the Beatles albums were so different from the other ones. If you think about it, like even in a short span of With the Beatles to A Hard Day's Night to Beatles For Sale, all three of those albums are very, very different from each other. I mean, With the Beatles is just, to me, it just sums up Beatlemania. It's just absolutely catchy pop songs. A Hard Day's Night was its own styled thing. All those songs just fit so perfectly together. Perfect pop songs. Then you have Beatles For Sale with its like more of a moody album of that country western undercurrent. So the Beatles were always changing and evolving, and they hardly ever looked back. So interesting to think about Beatles For Sale as kind of the Beatles country album. Okay, fact number 4. So there was a song recorded during the sessions for Beatles For Sale that didn't make it onto the album. That song is a cover song called Leave My Kitten Alone, and it's a great recording the Beatles made with John Lennon on lead vocal, and it's just an absolutely fantastic rock song. And to me, it's like in the same kind of vein as rock and roll music, which also appears on Beatles For Sale. But what's really insane is that Leave My Kitten Alone was not included on Beatles For Sale. Now, in my opinion, there are 3 songs on Beatles For Sale that any one of those could have been replaced with Leave My Kitten Alone, and it would have made the album even better. Those 3 songs, in my opinion, are Mr. Moonlight, Honey Don't, or Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Any of those songs, to me, could have been replaced with Leave My Kitten Alone, and it would have made the album so much stronger. And my number one choice would be Mr. Moonlight to be replaced. But for whatever reason, Leave My Kitten Alone was left off of the album. Either George Martin decided there was already enough John Lennon lead vocals on the album, or maybe John Lennon himself didn't even like his performance on Leave My Kitten Alone. Whatever the reason, the song was left unreleased for a very long time, although it was finally released on Beatles Anthology 2. So you should definitely check out Leave My Kitten Alone if you've never heard it before, because it's an excellent song recorded during these sessions, and it's fun to play the game of trying to figure out where it could have been placed on the album Beatles For Sale and what song it would have replaced. It's a fun little game to kind of figure out where you would put it if you had to put the album together yourself. So I love the song Leave My Kitten Alone. Okay, fact number 5. The song Every Little Thing, which is a great Lennon McCartney song, it's one of the rare instances where the song was mainly written by Paul, but John actually sings the lead vocal on it. So during the verses, John and Paul are both singing together in unison, but John's voice comes out way more than Paul's voice. And then on the chorus, Paul sings the high harmony, and John is really singing the main lead vocal. So it's a very interesting thing to hear a Paul song that's sung by John. And I think John sings it fantastic, by the way. In addition, I think Every Little Thing is an excellent song. This album, by the way, has a lot of fantastic Lennon McCartney originals, but I think Every Little Thing is one of the best ones on the album. My 2 favorite Lennon McCartney songs on this record happen to be No Reply and Every Little Thing. Both those songs are just so great. And Every Little Thing, actually, I think Paul even has gone on record and said that he was trying to write a single, but it just didn't end up being a single. But it's an excellent song. By the way, I think Every Little Thing would be a great song for Paul McCartney to do now at some of his shows. I think it's kind of in a lower register for him to sing, and I think he would sound really good on it. I doubt he'll ever do it, but Paul, if you're watching Every Little Thing, give it a go. Okay, number 6, the song What You're Doing, another amazing Lennon McCartney song. Now, this song has another kind of a rarity when it comes to Beatles recordings, and it has what I put with a question mark here, Ringo's first drum solo. Now, it's not really a drum solo, technically, I guess, because he's just really playing the backbeat of the song, but the song opens up with just Ringo playing the drums on What You're Doing. And technically, it's just the drums soloed. So it really kind of is a drum solo. Now, Ringo famously was just against drum solos. He didn't want to play drum solos. And of course, on Abbey Road, where he does play one of his only drum solos, official drum solos for the Beatles, he had to be persuaded to do it by Paul, and I think George Martin and the other Beatles kind of had to persuade him to do it. And by the way, it's fantastic. Probably one of the most memorable drum solos. Probably all of us right now could like hum or beat out Ringo's drum solo on the end, right? We all know it. But if you think about it on what you're doing, Ringo also is playing a drum solo. And in the intro and the song actually at the 2 minutes and 12-second mark on the stereo mix, everything drops out and it's just Ringo again playing that drum beat. And then Paul comes in with like a little bass lick. But really, on what you're doing, Ringo does technically kind of play a drum solo. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Fact number 7. Can you guess what George Martin's favorite song on Beatles for Sale was? I'll give you some time. Did you guess it? The answer is I'll Follow the Sun. So George Martin was asked what his favorite song was on Beatles for Sale, and he said I'll Follow the Sun. Now, to me, that's a very interesting choice. I love I'll Follow the Sun. I think it's a great song, but it's just a very short song. It's a very kind of a sweet song, a very kind of poignant Paul McCartney ballad. And Paul actually wrote I'll Follow the Sun when he was 16 years old, or he started it and then finished it up for this album. But it's interesting that George Martin would choose I'll Follow the Sun when the album has so many other key Beatle tracks on it, like 8 Days a Week, No Reply, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black, Every Little Thing. So many songs that are, in my opinion, are more famous and a little bit more of kind of more cutting edge when it comes to the Beatles tunes than I'll Follow the Sun. So it's an interesting choice for George Martin to choose I'll Follow the Sun. That being said, of course, I'll Follow the Sun has a beautiful melody, and I'm sure maybe that's why George Martin kind of gravitated towards that song. Okay, fact number 8. So we previously talked about Mr. Moonlight, but Mr. Moonlight is, in a lot of Beatle online polls I've seen, and just in certain magazines, and just talking with other friends of mine who love the Beatles, Mr. Moonlight, a lot of the time, is voted as one of the most disliked Beatle recordings. And I kind of understand why a lot of people don't like Mr. Moonlight, but I think it gets a little bit more hate than it deserves. Now, sure, is it as good as rock and roll music as far as Beatle covers? Is it as good as rock and roll music? No. Is it as good as even Honey Don't, Ringo singing? No. But is it better than like Matchbox that Ringo does? Yeah, I like it more than Matchbox. I even honestly like Mr. Moonlight a little bit more than Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, which is another cover on Beatles for Sale that George sings. But Mr. Moonlight does get voted down by a lot of Beatle fans as one of their least favorite Beatles recordings. And I think a lot of people point out the organ solo as it's just kind of like laughable. It just kind of seems like the Beatles aren't taking it too seriously. Now, I actually personally like the organ solo. It kind of sounds like ice skating, like an ice skating rink or something like that. And Paul's playing the organ solo. But it's interesting to note that Mr. Moonlight is just, generally, most people just do not like that song all that much. So, and by the way, it should have been replaced with Leave My Kitten Alone, but that's just my opinion. So, there you go. Fact number 9. So a lot of the songs on Beatles for Sale ended up being performed live by the Beatles. And those songs include I'm a Loser, Babies in Black, Rock and Roll Music, Kansas City, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. And famously, if you want to hear really great recordings of some of the songs, you can hear Babies in Black on the Beatles Hollywood Bowl album, on the new one that was just released with Giles Martin did the remix. You can hear it on there, and it's an excellent live recording. I like it a lot. In addition, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby on Beatles Anthology 2, there is a live recording from Shea Stadium that's very, very cool to listen to. And besides those songs that were performed live at Beatles concerts, they also recorded 2 other songs that are on the album for the BBC. And those songs are Words of Love and I'll Follow the Sun. Both are really, really cool recordings. And both of those can be found on Live at the BBC Volume 2 on air. So definitely check those out as well. So a lot of the songs, over 60% of the songs on Beatles for Sale were performed live in some way by the Beatles. So interesting to kind of note. And also interesting to note that a lot of the songs, or at least 2 of the songs on Beatles for Sale, were were played by the Beatles on their 66 tour, their last tour. And those are Babies in Black and Rock and Roll Music. Both were still performed on that tour. So kind of crazy to think about, because by 1966, you had songs like Paperback Writer and Nowhere Man and Taxman and these just advanced songs, but yet the Beatles were still playing Babies in Black and Rock and Roll Music. And I think that was more out of, I don't want to say laziness, but more out of just a necessity, because the Beatles couldn't really perfect songs like Taxman or Paperback Writer live, even though they did do Paperback Writer live, but it was a very challenging song to try to do, as opposed to songs like Rock and Roll Music and Babies in Black, where they could just kind of play those songs in their sleep. Okay, and the last fact number 10 here. So Beatles For Sale is famously, in my opinion, it's one of the most overlooked of all the Beatles albums. Probably not always overlooked as like Yellow Submarine, of course. But besides that, I think Beatles For Sale is one of the most overlooked Beatles albums. And sadly, it's also considered by a lot of Beatle fans that I see like on Beatle forums or in evening magazines or wherever online. A lot of Beatle fans consider Beatles For Sale their least favorite Beatles album. Now, I don't understand that at all, because I love Beatles For Sale. It ranks pretty high if I have to rank my favorite Beatles albums. And now, while it's certainly not a groundbreaking album like Sgt. Pepper or Revolver or Abbey Road, or, the Beatles had so many groundbreaking albums, it's not a groundbreaking album in that sense. But at the same time, it's still full of classic Beatles songs and Beatles performances and recordings. But some of the like original Beatles songs like No Reply, 8 Days a Week, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black, All Follow the Sun, etc. Those are classic Beatles songs. And any other band, by the way, let's just say like a random band in 1964 put out an album with the songs I just mentioned and played as well as the Beatles played them and recorded them, that would be an absolutely classic record. It would just go down in history as like one of the best records of all time. But because the Beatles were the Beatles and they put out so many amazing records, a lot of the times Beatles For Sale gets overlooked, because you have the Sgt. Peppers and the Revolvers and the Rubber Souls and the Abbey Roads and the White Albums that are just such classic records. That's a lot of times Beatles For Sale gets passed over. And maybe rightfully so, because the albums I just mentioned are such classics. But in my opinion, Beatles For Sale is also a classic album. And also, I think it's probably the Beatles' hidden gem. If you had to pick one album that is just kind of a lot of like casual fans maybe don't know that much about, it's got to be Beatles For Sale. And it's also an album that I think if you had like a new Beatle fan who had only heard the White Album and maybe only heard like Sgt. Pepper and Revolver, if you recommended Beatles For Sale to them, I guarantee they would love it and it would really blow them away, because it's such a great record. So those are my 10 facts about the Beatles album, Beatles For Sale, that perhaps you didn't know. Perhaps you knew all those facts, and you're thinking like, come on, he didn't say this fact. Well, if there's a fact that you think I missed that I should have included, please, in the comments below, let me know, because I enjoy reading all kinds of facts about the Beatles, and I love having discussions as well in the comments. So comment away. I'd love to hear if there's something that you think I missed, or if I said something that you think is incorrect. I'm all totally for you correcting me and let me know what you think is the actual fact. But Beatles For Sale, it's a great album. So stay tuned for my next top 10 fact Beatle album. And of course, it's going to be the album Help. So stay tuned for Help. And of course, go to my website, needlemeetsvinyl.com, and check out all kinds of records on there. Hey, that's it. So talk to you later. Bye for now.